It's the same with cordyceps. I mean, it changes the behavior of the insects so that they will typically go to higher levels in the trees, so that then when the cordyceps burst out the back of their head, it's able to shower spores on the rest of the ants. So it's trying to turn the zombie ant into this dispersal mechanism.
I can't think of any more human activity than conducting science experiments.
The game I play is a very interesting one. It's imagination in a tight straitjacket.
The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together.
What I always think should be the basis of education is not answers, but questions. We should teach kids how to question.
Welcome to BLab Codes. My name is Amit Siddiqui. So on this week's episode, I got the chance to sit down and talk to Dr. Oliver Morton, who is a microbiologist that is fascinated with fungi. I really enjoyed my conversation with Oliver. He's a really funny guy, and his journey was very interesting, and his research is very interesting as well. So before I actually start the interview with him, I do need to mention that if you guys could like and give us some feedback on our Facebook page, that would be awesome. And also, I have my friend's company over here. He's got a tutoring company called Intuitive Education at Campbelltown. So you can actually check out his tutoring company. I'm not going to say www, even though I just said it like an idiot. But it's intuitive hyphen, so that's not underscore, it's intuitive-education.com. And the mobile phone number is 0416 897 018. 0416 897 018. So if you need a tutor for a family member or friends or whatever, let Kyle know, send him a message, or hit him up and check out his website. Without further ado, I suppose this is my interview with Dr. Oliver Morton. Hope you guys enjoy it.
Anyway, yeah, I thought you were going to go with the standard Australian, how are you going? And when I first arrived here, I get by train. And I thought it was like, your journey? Well, I got on at Redfern, and I changed at Clyde, and sometimes that's a bit like a journey into science. So, and I guess like if you're doing the David Copperfield thing, well, I was young in the beginning, and I wanted to be a marine biologist.
Really?
When I was just a little one, because I thought sharks were cool, and I thought, beautiful oceans full of fish, whales, and stuff. It'll be brilliant. And then you realise you live in Ireland, and the water's brown.
Yeah. The water's what? Brown?
It's dark. It's murky. Everything's brown and grey. Like when you come to Australia from Ireland, when you go to Coles at the fish counter, it's like going to an exotic aquarium. Everything back home is grey or brown.
Nice.
Yeah, they are. They're all grey or brown. It's just really dull. And the sharks, I mean, they could eat a fish, but they're not going to hurt a person. It's just not the same. And I sort of, when you realize that, you're just like, well, you need to adapt your options a little bit to what you're doing. And they still do marine biology, but it's not this TV stuff. It's not Jacques Cousteau, out in the ocean, and I guess that was when I was young, but I had the idea that I'd wanted to be a scientist at that point, and I'd always been pretty good at biology, so
that came natural to you?
Yeah. I mean, that was what I pretty much had an aptitude for, and I think that's handy. Just generally in anything, go at the thing you enjoy. Because life is longer than you expect. And a lot of people say life's short, but when you're spending time at a bus stop, it seems very long. And you don't want your work day to be like hanging at a bus stop or waiting for the dentist. You want to enjoy it. You want to kind of skip to work.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I mean, I've spoken to a few people on this podcast, and I think the advice that I like the best is when they tell us to actually do what they enjoy, because it's such a good point. I mean, if you spend your life doing things that you don't enjoy, to make a living so that you can go on living, that is to do things that you don't enjoy to make a living. I think it's just a vicious cycle of unhappiness.
Yeah. Apparently, it's what marriage is like. Boom.
You're not married? No, I don't see any ring.
Not exactly.
Oh, nice.
I just like to give everyone a hard time. No,
I like it.
What was I going to say? Yeah, I mean, you have to enjoy what you do. I mean, I think the saying is, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life, and I think that's the ideal. You know, and if you love doing carpentry and stuff, then do that. You know,
For sure.
I think sometimes there's a strong pressure on people to go to university when it's not really for them.
Yeah.
I think if you found that you weren't academically inclined at school, university is the same, just the teachers don't care.
Yeah, that's so true.
You know, it's not suddenly a magical world where you're going to have a completely different experience.
No.
You can have a much worse experience because nobody's chasing you.
Right.
You know, so if you're not motivated or interested in it, you're just going to rack up a debt for no good reason.
That's true.
But if that's what really excites you, if you want to learn, you know, and if finding out new things or you have a particular area of interest, and you know, by going to university you can develop that interest and that can set you up for your future, then it's a very
By all means, do it.
good thing. Because I think what's happened a lot over the last, you know, certainly, you know, since you know, coming here and being more involved in academia, you know, a lot of students feel pressured to end up in university, I think. Whether that's family pressure or, you know, and it's not necessarily for everyone. So I think in terms of the journey, it needs to make sense, you know, what you go on to do.
Yeah. I think you raise a really good point. I mean, I've been involved in teaching almost 4 years here now, and I love seeing students who are really passionate and are driven. Even though they don't know what they want to do, they are just following their passion and desires. And then conversely, I see students who are just there for the sake of being there because their parents expect this of them, their family expects this of them, and they just put a shit effort through, and there's almost no point. You're in debt for like 30 grand. You've learnt nothing because you have a degree that's predominantly passes and credits or fails or whatever. And at the end of the day, you're like, well, that's 3-4 years of my life wasted.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I you know, just look, if you want a career in retail, then doing a science degree is not a good option.
It's funny because a lot of science students go into retail.
They do, don't they? I mean, because a lot of students work in, you know, in various retail outlets, and you know, that's good if that's your short-term thing. But if that's really what you're interested in, you know, you should really do business.
That's right. Yeah.
Or you know, economics or something. But I always knew that. I kind of wanted to do biology. That was my thing. I mean, for a while, I was kind of thinking I should do business. So when I was at school, I was able to cover myself a bit by doing a mix of, you know, science and business type topics. But basically, once I was ready to go to university, I wanted to do biology. At that point, though, I didn't necessarily know what I was going to be doing exactly.
Right.
You know, so I thought I would tend towards zoology.
So you were still interested in animals?
Yeah. You know, as long as it wasn't people, I was good. You know, I never had an interest in doing medicine.
Right.
You know, so that was never something that interested me.
You just didn't want to deal with sick people? Was that the case?
You know what? You know, people are hard work on a good day. But meeting people on their worst day, you know, sick people, screaming babies, you know, these people are not happy.
Right.
And also the families of sick people are not happy either. You know, so it's not the best time to catch people. I think you need a good manner, or at least a lot of patience.
Yeah, and you gotta want to do it.
I think so. I think, I mean, you know, we could spend half an hour talking about the issues that have begun to crop up in medical teaching and in medicine recently, which is there's a lot of people are going into it for the wrong reasons, like for status and, you know, for golf membership and. Well, you know, just, you know, it goes along with having money, right? So they think they're going to have a very good living, and you can do, but again, you know, it's about dealing with people who are at their most vulnerable. I mean, if you don't care about them, you know, they're not going to get as good a service, and then people turn to things like homeopathy because in you know, there's no science behind it, but they get very good care.
That's right.
People listen to them.
Yeah.
And so they feel like they have a much better experience than somebody going, take 2 of these, now get out.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's true. Like you have a 10-minute interaction with your doctor, whereas
Yeah.
if you go to a homeopath, you get an hour.
Yeah.
And that human interaction it's actually really fascinating because medicine is a bit of voodoo, right? So if you
Well,
believe something is going to help you, it helps
The
you.
placebo effect is real.
Yeah, even when you're taking medication, right? You usually realize that it's working once you notice the side effects, and that enforces the placebo.
But even the thing is, if you feel better, even if your disease is not changing, that's still a better outcome for the
sure.
patient.
Yeah.
You know, you can either be bedridden and depressed about your life, or you can at least be happy about the time you've got left.
That's true.
And go and keep living. So
Yeah.
but you know, part of the problem in medicine is how do you recruit people with empathy?
Yeah.
You know, people who are able to respond to other human beings rather than, you know, I've got to do 10 appointments an hour. I've got to, you know, get them out the door quickly.
Yeah.
You know, but in terms of, my journey, that wasn't something I was particularly interested in doing.
Why were you drawn towards biology?
I think I've always just been, you know, from a kid, you know, I liked having pets. I always liked going to zoos. I know that's controversial, but you don't know when you're 5 years old that it's bad for the animals.
Yeah.
You know, maybe I should just visit in prisons. I would have liked people more. Who knows?
Right.
But yeah, and I suppose because, you know, I just spent I guess it's all David Attenborough's fault.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You've watched these documentaries when you were young?
From all the time.
Really?
You know, mainly when I became more of a professional scientist, I was less interested because I got less out of them. Because I felt that, you know, as a kid and that, it was a great way to learn about the world. And I think I was interested about how life works and, you know, how the world works. And I think, you know, you get that through pursuing biology.
Right.
But as you become more of a professional scientist, these type of TV shows aren't, you know, you get annoyed by what they're not covering.
Yeah, right.
They run up a lot of kind of dead ends. I remember there was one about the workings of the universe with Sam Neill. I think the BBC and Discovery spent a lot of money on it. He spent most of the time talking about questions he never answered, and I just began to find them, you know, incredibly frustrating, because they, you know, but that's the difference, you know. At a certain point, you've got to move beyond.
That's right.
You know what people can show in that format, and you know, become strangely interested in a single protein. You know, and you know, just 2 isoforms of a protein, and you know, focus down at a tiny level. But no. So when I got to university, I thought I want to do biology, but you know, at that point, I guess it's the opposite of, you know, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Whereas if you know nothing, you think you know everything. I mean, I was just like, the more I started to learn, the more I realized I didn't know anything, or I hadn't appreciated, you know, the vastness of what was out there. And just in first year biology, I was just, you know, I was getting like, plants are pretty cool, which was a surprise, and then these fungi things were awesome, and I was like, these are cool. But also I was doing geology, and I thought, you know, and that was cool until we had a lecturer who was going through crystallography, and he looked like Mr. Bean, and I just couldn't take it seriously anymore.
You ruined geology.
He really did. Well, mainly crystallography, because I was just like, I don't care about dodecahedrons this much, you know, and then it turned out that the interesting parts of geology required a lot more mathematics and physics than I was necessarily comfortable with. But no, so I kept on the biology path, and then you know, because the Irish system is a 4-year undergrad, so typically we do a lot of subjects in high school. And so you can't do each of them to a super high level. So the first year is mostly about, you know, bringing up your level in chemistry and physics and maths and biology and maybe computing, depending on what you want to do. And second year is more like full fat university. So that was sort of where I was able to do zoology as a subject and botany, because they split up the sciences, and microbiology. But that was mainly industrial microbiology. So I think sometimes your exposure to a subject can be, you know, very important, the way it's presented. So industrial micro didn't really interest me that greatly. I mean, now obviously I teach medical microbiology, and with elements of applied microbiology. But when I was 18 or 19, I was like, I don't want to work in a factory making enzymes,
Right.
or doing quality control in a food factory and stuff. It just didn't seem very interesting.
What did you want to do at that age?
I was like, I was still not sure. Like the path, I knew I had another couple of years left in university, and hopefully I'd figure it out.
Yeah. So you said botany, microbiology,
And zoology.
Zoology. And which of those did you get drawn into? I suspect it was microbiology, right?
Well, no. I mean, the way they'd presented microbiology wasn't that interesting because it was industrial.
Industrial, okay.
And so that was far too applied. But thanks to a little quirk of fate, mycology was taught in the botany department, because originally they thought fungi were plants. And so they also didn't have a pure microbiology department. So I was able to study fungi in botany.
Wow.
And that's where I really got stuck into them, because I was like, these things are awesome. Because you don't realize, at that point, I just thought fungi are mushrooms, and I don't like them that much. But if they're hidden in food, they're okay.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to eat one by itself, But then you find out, things about mycorrhizal fungi, which extend the root network of plants and then help plants to communicate with each other. And it's like, this stuff's crazy. I didn't know these things existed. And I just thought mushrooms were these distinct little things, but the mushroom's just a tiny part of this much larger network.
Right.
And so all this stuff that comes up in Avatar about all the plants talking to each other, it's not the plants, it's the fungi that are letting them talk to each other. And so I got really fascinated, and I was looking at, plant pathogenic fungi were really interesting as well, in terms of how they were able to pick the lock and break into the house, and actually cause infection. And it turned out that this kind of problem solving by pathogens was really interesting as well. So I became much more interested in that than I was in zoology,
Right.
or in micro at the time.
Right. You mentioned the micros, or I should say the fungal relationship with trees and plants. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that? Because I think that's fascinating.
So it's a really, it's one of those areas that most people don't appreciate, but all flowering plants, the angiosperms, 95% of them form associations with fungi. And these are beneficial symbiotic relationships. So a lot of plants grow in areas where they have difficulty obtaining nutrients. So plants are kind of restricted to the types of forms of phosphorus and nitrogen they can acquire from the soil. So they form symbioses with fungi, because fungi can degrade organic sources of nitrogen and phosphorus, so they can obtain nutrients that the plants can't get hold of, and in return for this, the plants give them sugars. And so they form this nice symbiosis. And basically what happens as well is the fungi are very fine hair-like structures which basically extend the root system. And so they provide a much larger surface area as well for uptake of moisture and various nutrients, and they are able to channel these. But what happens with the fungus is it just continually grows as this large clonal organism, so it can connect more than one plant. So that what they found is that plant signaling molecules move through the network of the fungus as well, so that they can talk to each other. Right. And this is sort of at the edges of, where that type of research is now. Is what does communication mean in these organisms? Do we know enough about plants? Because in some ways we see them as very static objects, but they actually seem to do a lot more complex things, and they can signal to each other. And it's also, the fungi may be facilitating these communication networks, and they found that, I think it was a single forest in the west coast of the US. When they did sampling, they found that the whole forest was connected by a single clone of one fungus.
Wow.
So I think that came up is they did some mathematics, and this would be the largest single organism on the planet.
Wow. Is this in South America somewhere?
No, in North America.
North America.
Yeah, because
in the north.
So up the west coast of the US.
Yeah, northwest. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Washington State kind of area, because that's very forested. But so in these areas, they're all connected, by these fungi, and they actually, make mycorrhizal fungi as fertilizer supplements. So you're trying to grow a plant in your garden. Your garden's not great, so you add these, and they help it to grow better.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, so because the closest that plants really get to obtaining organic source of nitrogen, that is like a Venus flytrap.
Oh yeah.
Or one of those pitcher plants where they catch insects.
Yep.
And so they're doing that because they want to get, amino acids, and they want to get nitrogen and phosphate and stuff that, other plants can do by their associations with fungi.
Right.
So I mean, that's sort of one of the cool areas. I sort of moved away from that.
Before we move on, I just wanted to, I heard that this fungi can actually, so if there's a whole network of trees, if there's a sick plant, it can actually draw nutrients from the healthy plants and direct it to the sick plant.
Potentially. Yeah, I mean it's possible. I mean it takes a lot of experimentation to figure that out. But I think the other thing is that, some plant pathogenic fungi also use this type of moving between roots to infect other plants as well. So it's not all necessarily good news.
Right.
But what they are finding is that some of these fungi that grow in association with the plants help protect them from infection as well.
Okay.
So there's a lot of work on what are called endophytes, which are microbes that grow within the plants.
Oh, so it's like
the plant's own microbiome.
Wow.
So there's a lot of work moving into that area as well. So I think, the good thing about any sort of science is that people who are doing really good experiments they actually, lead to many more questions. It brings you back to like ideas that, there's a quote that's, attributed to the Surgeon General in the US in sort of the 60s, and they declared the war on infectious diseases to be over. Because they had antibiotics, nobody saw resistance coming, nobody saw the AIDS epidemic, nobody, knew any of this was coming, and they were like, well, it was like the guy in the patents office at the end of the 1800 saying, well, nothing else is going to be invented. People have these crazy ideas, but once people actually do some good work, it shows you what's out there or what needs to be discovered, and so I think any scientist who's doing their work well is finding some answers but more questions.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's good for students.
Yeah,
because then we need students to help us answer the questions, but also generate some new questions, which is then good for your career,
right?
Potentially, because hopefully it's those questions that will keep you occupied for 40 years.
Yeah.
Because we got to keep you guys off the streets.
These hooligans.
Exactly.
Hooligan scientists just losing control and mob mentality, breaking beakers on the streets and.
Yeah, well, nobody breaks beakers on the streets. They're too valuable.
Oh, that's true.
That's the whole meth lab industry is another conversation. I'm not a chemist.
Okay, so you did that work on fungi.
Yeah.
Then how did you transition? Did you get into research?
So when I was an undergrad, I worked on these fungi that associate with plant roots, and I was sick for about a year after my first degree. But at the end of my first degree, I'd pretty much decided I wanted to continue, this path of learning. So that meant postgraduate research, and I got really good grades mostly as well. I mean, you need that kind of positive reinforcement, I think, as well, to show you that what you're doing is the right path. I think, I got the highest grades in botany, so I stayed with that as my major, which is, but not to brag, I got the highest marks in all the subjects I did, but I just got higher ones in botany, whereas relatively they were all the same, but it just looked better, And so I pursued that course, and at the time, this was before Ireland had, before the global financial crisis, but also before the economy was doing really well, and there was really very limited sort of investment in science in Ireland. So I went to Britain to do my PhD, So in Britain, they would actually, give you a stipend. So it's a bit like the postgraduate scholarships available in Australia, and those were competitive, but it was a bit like a job interview. And so I ended up doing an EU-funded project in Britain, which won't be possible after Brexit. So that's a door that's closed on a few people. But yeah, so and that was a slightly different area. But it was in looking at crop research and how fungi could be used to prevent certain plant parasites from causing disease.
Okay.
So there are a group of worms called nematodes, or in America, nematodes.
Yep.
And they cause plant parasitic diseases. So two of the major ones are root knot disease and root gall disease. And so they disfigure the roots so that the plants can take up nutrients, and therefore they don't flower and produce fruit as well. So it's a real problem in tomatoes and potatoes. And mainly what they'd found was that it was a huge problem in Southern Europe, because they use a lot of glasshouse horticulture. And so the guy who I eventually did a PhD for had done work on how certain soils seem to be suppressive to these nematodes, like plants grown in these soils don't develop infection. And it turned out there were two fungi that killed off these nematodes. One of them was an obligate parasite, so it couldn't be cultured. And they did this discovery in the 70s, and they had no chance. But the other one was just a standard soil fungus, which happened to like attacking nematode eggs. And so if it attacked the nematode eggs, it decreased the overall abundance of nematodes, and therefore the crops were less affected. And so they were working on that for several years and trying to formulate it and figure out how it would be converted into a biological control agent. And when I went there, they were very interested in utilizing molecular biology to start looking at the virulence factors that allowed the fungus to attack the nematodes and dissect that. And so I never did any field work, which is probably handy. So I never got to roll in the dirt. But I was in the Department of Soil Science, which is hard to explain to people.
Right.
When you tell your elderly relatives that you're in the Department of Soil Science, and like, so what kind of job can you get with that? And it's like, are there buckets? And me begonias. How do I make those grow better? Look, I think you've got the wrong idea about what I've been studying. Because that was the other thing. I'd done a degree in botany, and yet I couldn't grow any plants or veggies. And they're like, well, I know how they work. It doesn't mean I know how to grow them.
That's so funny. It's funny because before the podcast, you and I were talking about, we can talk about dirt if that's what interests you. Yeah, we are talking about dirt.
Look, in the ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We always end up there eventually. But yeah, so I did a lot of biological work on the actual fungus itself, looking at enzymes it produced that allowed it to grow into the nematode eggs. So basically these nematodes, they burrow into the roots, and then they produce a reaction where the root deforms, but they leave their eggs on the outside of the root surface. And so the fungus grows onto these eggs, and then just burrows a little hole into the eggshell, and then grows throughout the baby worm inside and digests it. So what happens is that if these nematodes aren't present, that fungus is not very competitive in the soil environment. So there are other things that outcompete it. But when the nematodes are there, it gives it access to, a unique resource that then allows it to, produce specialized spores that, until the next growing season. So we were really interested in that. And
just a question. So when the nematodes aren't there, can the fungi still survive? But
not as well.
Okay.
So they'll stay in dormant states.
Sure.
Or they'll be in much lower numbers.
But they would get activated once you add some nematodes. So you could potentially only have a small number of those fungi, even in dormant stage in the soil. And then once the infection happens, and they get activated.
Yeah, I think ideally you need a high abundance of the fungus. Because again, in a lot of biology, especially microbiology, it's based on probability. So if you were thinking about cubic meters of soil and the organism's 10 microns across,
Right.
it has to encounter
That's right.
its food somehow. It's like if I dropped you in the middle of Alice Springs and said, look, somewhere in the great sandy desert, there's a bear.
Right.
You need to find it,
Find it.
before you die. It's so you have to look at it from their point of view.
Sure.
But also, so you have to bias the interactions a lot of the time, so that a plant root system to us, seems very dense to a thing that's tiny. It may be very hard to actually get there. So you actually need to build up the numbers of the organism to make sure they encounter the nematode.
I see.
Yeah. So you have to think of it in terms of, what does the environment look like with respect to the organism you're trying to introduce.
Okay, sure. That makes sense. Obviously. I thought maybe.
No, but
through
most
magic,
people most people don't think about the spatial.
It's like a chemical
arrangements.
reaction. I mean,
Yeah.
if the concentrations are low, you
Yeah,
might
it's
have to wait
stoichiometry,
weeks.
isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're essentially you're focusing on the mechanism of how the fungi can actually kill the baby eggs.
Yeah.
It,
Yeah, I kill babies. Well, I used to. I've stopped that now. I've been rehabilitated. Well, yeah, there was pickets by nematodes outside the research center going, stop the slaughter.
of them.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if they did that?
It'd be hilarious.
That'd be hilarious.
They were like, look,
Free the nematodes.
we're going to start infecting humans if you don't. Yeah, so, but, after a while, I think one of the problems was around the late 90s and, heading to 2000 when I was doing that, there was really, in Britain, again, when you go to a career in science and you move around, you've sometimes got to go where funding is.
Mm-hmm.
And what was happening there were legitimate questions about the future of agriculture in Britain, because this was before the global financial crisis, this was before the World Trade Center, and so countries like Britain were net importers of foods. Like they would get capsicums, they don't grow in Britain, but they're everywhere. And so it was really tough for farmers at that time because the prices were going down, the markets were shrinking because of cheap imports. Even in Ireland at that time, there was a net import of potatoes from Eastern Europe, which is ridiculous. And when Ireland's famous for potatoes, but they production had reduced, and so funding was leaving agriculture.
Right.
And so there was a time where the project I was working on, it didn't look like it would be renewed. And so sometimes you have to check your options and go, what do I need to do for myself? And I had the idea I'd like to, transition into medical microbiology. So you can take the skills that you learn and apply them to something else. One of my people I collaborated with in the UK, he'd worked on the microbiology of Antarctic, cores. So he did a lot of soil microbiology, and now he runs a pathology lab for a hospital.
Wow.
And to a microorganism, humans aren't that different from soil.
Really?
Really, if you think about it, a microbe doesn't perceive you as an individual. It perceives you as a collection of microenvironments and nutrient sources. And so, you present somewhere that if they can survive, there's a lot of nutrients. So all of the extensive microbes that live within you are in specific places where, let's say in your gut, you're at 37 degrees. It's a great temperature for them to grow. There's always mucus. There's always food being digested. So they have a great life, right? So we're a perfect habitat. And relative to a bacterium, the ratio of size of a bacterium to you is you to Australia. Right.
Yeah.
So think about your interaction with the continent,
Right.
or the country. That's
Yeah.
what a bacterium sees you as.
Wow.
And actually, Australia is a really good comparison because microbes mostly grow in the center of the body or around the edges, right? Because And everywhere else, like the big sandy desert, there's no water, but microbes typically don't grow in your tissues unless you're ill, right? So your immune system, keeps them in check, but it keeps them in places where you need and want them, right? So your skin's covered in microbes, but it's not a bad thing. They're meant to be there.
Yeah, they help you out, and people who overuse the hand sanitizers start to develop problems.
Yep.
Because they've killed the natural microbes that exist on their hand. And
I think the recommendation is soap and water.
Soap and water.
That's it.
Yeah.
You don't need anything else.
No.
Well, you need to know how to wash your hands properly, which is always handy.
It's handy to know.
Yeah. It's but it's one of the first things they teach you in sort of micro training, maybe in first year or the first time you go into a lab is, a professional lab is, here's how to wash your hands.
Yeah.
And they'll put that stuff on your hands as well, and you wash them, and they'll put it under a light, and you'll find that, all your calluses have microbes stuck in them, and you're like, oh my God, better wear gloves when I'm lifting weights, or stop doing things that develop calluses, But yeah, I mean, you have to appreciate when you start working in microbiology that they look at things a little bit differently. Your perspective changes, and so because we anthropomorphize things, just think of yourself in like a drop of water to a microbe is like you being dropped in a lake.
Right. It's huge.
Yeah, and the other thing is, they have no real control over where they're going because surface tension is more important and Brownian motion, and these things have an effect.
Right.
Fungi are quite good because they form these filamentous networks which are under pressure so that they have directional movement. The whole organism doesn't move, but the tips of the organism can move, and because they're under this turgor pressure and release enzymes, they can grow into tissues or into wood, which is how you get your wood rot, or if you have athlete's foot, they start growing through your skin or into your skin.
So those enzymes break down the barriers and then enables them to
and then they're able to push in. So that's their thing. Right. So unlike bacteria, which kind of don't produce this pressure, they just kind of form clumps and then are dispersed by liquids, and that fungi have a central starting point, and then they grow radially in all directions. And what will happen is the amount of growth will depend on nutrient density. So if they won't grow very densely in a nutrient per area, but they'll just extend the filaments relatively quickly to try and find some nutrients. So what they've done is they've done these kind of experiments with slime molds where they've put a nutrient source, far away from where the slime mold is, and the slime mold will then find the quickest route to the nutrient source. And what they found is that they did an experiment trying to figure out, what's the best train route between, let's say, London and Edinburgh. And so they got a slime mold to grow on it, and they actually found that it found a really quick route.
Whoa.
Because it's basically, they work like a machine learning algorithm almost, so that they're testing the environment and, finding the best route between their starting point and where the nutrient source is.
Whoa.
And so it's not like they're thinking about it, but the way they approach it.
Computating.
Yeah.
Wow,
it makes a lot of sense. And so, and if you look at the way army ants move in the environment, they actually move in a pattern that looks a lot like the way a fungus grows.
Really?
Yeah. So their kind of scavenging pattern looks a lot like the way filaments of a fungus grow out. You only notice this if you have fungi on your brain, though. But yeah, so one of the things in your journey is you need to have a bit of keep an eye on where the wind is blowing.
Right.
Especially with funding.
Right.
So if your local government has said our research area will now be X, and you work on Z,
right,
you may want to find somewhere else to
work on X.
To work. No,
or
change
leave. To Z. Yeah.
So or leave the country and go somewhere else. I think the best thing about the journey in science is it takes you places.
Right.
Like, so I've always moved, depending on what I've needed in my career or where the opportunities were. So, I mean, Ireland was a good place at the time to have a basic education, but not so good when you wanted to do postgraduate work or to move on and have a career in science at the time. So Britain was obviously much better. It's one of the real engines of research in the world. Probably not so much in the next few years, but yeah, I mean, if you're willing to move, then fungi took me from Ireland to Australia.
Okay, so you went to Britain and then to Australia.
Well, actually, it's slightly more circuitous than that. So I moved to Scotland for a while to work on antifungal drug mechanisms. So I was looking at yeast as a model organism of fungus and testing novel antifungal compounds and looking at how the yeast responded and trying to determine the mode of action. So it was a slightly different type of research, but still in fungi. But it gave me a chance to learn some techniques. And I think one of the things a lot of people sort of forget is that when you're doing your PhD or maybe your first postdoctoral job, you should be trying to learn as many different things as possible. It's a really good opportunity to learn new things, and you should always be trying to learn or do new things, because as a journey, it's also about lifelong learning. And I think most people would say you'll have several careers in your life. Even if you don't have several different careers, you're going to change what you work on at several points. So you've always got to be willing to adapt,
always adapting,
change and learn
new skills. How did your skill set change from your PhD to, let's say, how many postdocs did you do?
I've done 3.
You've done 3. And so how did that develop? I mean, from a PhD all the way to then your postdoc.
The PhD was very focused on fungal virulence, but then that project in the postdoc, I did a postdoc where I did my PhD for 2 years, and the project changed a lot because it became more focused on plant metabolomics. So what chemicals were the plants producing? And so that led to a lot more trying to grow plants. And for a while they thought I might be a really good herbicide because all the plants kept dying.
I was actually, for a second I was gonna say, now you could go and tell your grandma, look, I can grow some plants.
I can kill them. just leave me in a forest for a day, and I'll get rid of all those pesky trees.
Right.
But in some ways it's funny, but in other ways, when you're, that's a very important time in your career. Is your first postdoc. You want to be working on something that's going to generate publications and set you up for your career. So it's very frustrating when stuff's not working. And the project had really changed a lot away from what I was really interested in, and so I quit that. I think sometimes you've got to know when to cut your losses. Now, I'd had a really great time there during my PhD, and everyone was super supportive, but I just for me, I didn't see a future in doing that. I wasn't that interested. Probably should have stayed on. You never know. But you have to leave at some point. You can't stay in one institution, because I think it's bad for you as a scientist.
In what way?
I think it's important to see how other people do things. So in some ways, when you do a PhD, it's an apprenticeship, and then your next job, you're still learning. But in some ways, the people who are managing you maybe still see you as a student,
right,
rather than someone who's moved on from that state.
Right.
But the other thing is, you just get used to how things are done. You think that's how things are done. And I think when you move around, you can find that's not necessarily the way.
Right.
There are different approaches and there are different ways. And the more people you can learn from, I think especially in your formative years as a scientist, the better. So I think if you have opportunities to travel during a PhD or during a degree, let's say to do maybe a semester in a different country, or go to a collaborator's lab, I mean that's a really great experience.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it brings you to new places, you meet new people, you see there are different ways of doing things. Maybe you learn new ways of managing things.
Sure.
Or not everyone has the best boss in the world, or that, but maybe you can learn how to manage or deal with someone like that, because that's important. No matter where you go, is managing up as well as down. You've got to learn how to interact with people who are in senior positions. I think sometimes when you get out and about, I mean, travel broadens the minds, but also working in different places and experiencing different cultures in the lab. Some places will be much stricter, some places will be a bit freer, but I think it's good to get out and about. If you've only experience one thing, you're missing out.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Look, I'm about to hit my PhD next year, so I'm not even up to a postdoc. But I've tried to travel, at least to China. I got a couple of scholarships, and when I went there, one was for this Chinese speaking competition that I competed at for the finals over there, and they gave me like pretty much all expense paid to trip over there. But I met some of the smartest people I'd ever met in my life. People who could speak like 6 different languages, people who were physicists and engineers and philosophers and like people from Stanford, Harvard, the top universities. And I thought this is the importance of traveling, because these people expand your mind, and you would have never had this opportunity if you didn't take the risk and actually come and travel.
Yeah, no, you've got to get out and about.
Yeah,
I think as much as anything, you have to, encounter new ways of thinking. Actually, there's a lot of studies that say, becoming multilingual actually changes how you perceive things. It changes the way you think and your perceptions. So that's obvious. I'm terrible at other languages, apart from swearing.
Just Irish English and English.
Yeah. Well, I did French and
did you
Gaelic
really?
at school.
Oh, wow.
But I have no aptitude for learning languages. So, I mean, I can ask for beer in a number of languages.
That's the
which is a good skill.
You remind me of my friend. He went to Mexico or Brazil, and he only knew one word. Almost cerveja, por favor. Beer, please.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it.
Just the one, though.
That's it. He just kept asking that question over and over again.
Yeah. There was one guy I know, and he was going to Germany, and the only phrase he'd heard was "Zwei Bier bitte," so 2 beers, please.
Oh, nice.
But obviously, he walked into a bar, and they were looking at him weird because he wanted 2 beers, and he was on his own.
Like my imaginary friend.
Yeah, exactly. Or so, are you thirsty?
That's hilarious.
It's like, you Irish people drink, don't you? Or they thought it was an interesting, way to pick up people.
Right.
It's just like, I'm sure somebody will come.
That's not a bad way. That's pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah.
2 beers.
Oh, I've got 2 drinks. Want to help me? There are many things you learn on the journey through science.
Right.
But the other thing, depending on where you are, I mean, some science is done in the pub.
Yeah.
It's and in certain countries that the level to which that happens is different as well.
Right.
So there's also a cultural aspect as well. That you have to get used to how some people do things.
Right.
As well. So in Britain, there's a real pub culture around it, and a lot of stuff goes on. Obviously, conferences get a bit messy for some people, but in the US, it's very much business hours.
Okay.
And that's a little bit different. And Australia is a kind of a mix. It's a bit of a hybrid.
That's cool.
Ireland's a bit more like the US.
Oh, really?
No, it's a kind of a hybrid as well. A bit more like the UK, but in some ways, some people are very careerist and career-minded, and
I see.
You'll only find them in their office.
Right.
And they don't come out to the pub too much, or have fun.
Right.
In the same way. So but it's tends to be very variable.
Right.
But no, I mean mostly plugging through a career in sciences, it's just a good experience. You don't get to meet real people very often. I tend to find you just spend most of your time with scientists, and occasionally you meet civilians, and then you end up with the old problem of trying to explain what you do.
Not sounding like a madman.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, they're like, so what do you do? I'm like, well, I'm a pilot. It's like, well, I'm a scientist. I have a strange fascination with spores, molds, and fungus. Like the guy from Ghostbusters, and or you just go, well, I work on thrush.
Oh my god!
It's the best opening line you can have. It's like,
oh god, you're a pilot. I'm a thrush.
Yeah, exactly. But that's a life in science.
Hilarious.
But I think part of your podcast is a really good thing about listening to people, but also the idea of thinking about how to communicate what you do. Because I think a lot of scientists, we're very insular. We're stuck in our worlds. We don't even talk to bacteriologists.
Yeah.
You know, if you work on fungi, it's not that you don't want to talk to them; they won't talk to you.
Right.
You know, because and everyone's in their little silos.
That's true. Yeah.
And we definitely don't talk to chemists.
Yeah. It's so funny because like physicists give biologists shit, chemists give biologists shit, and then we turn around and give like psychologists shit. And then it's like a
it's a vicious cycle of abuse.
It's just hilarious, you know. Because from the outside, you're like, you guys are all the same shit. What are you guys on about, you know?
Yeah, but but there's a certain amount of my fungus can jump higher than your bacteria. No, and
that's my shit is cooler than yours.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Mine got on the news yesterday. Nobody's going to die from your disease. Nobody famous.
So
for a while we were talking about how to because when I left Scotland, I went back to Ireland for a while because in the period I'd been away from Ireland, it had become much more successful.
Oh.
So there was a .com boom. There was lots of money in the country. There was a lot of investment. Turned out it was all on shifting sands and poor foundations, but in the 10 years I'd been away from Ireland, it had changed and had become a lot more like the research culture in the UK. There were many more opportunities to do science. There was a lot more funding. There was, PhD studentships were more readily available, and so it had completely turned around. Unfortunately, a year after I went back to Ireland, the GFC happened, and the place went back to became a bit of a basket case again. It was just horrible, how... but I mean, that was difficult as well because there was pay cuts all around, and I think my pay dropped 15% in a year.
Whoa.
And it became really tough, and then the avenues for continued funding dried up. Right. And so from going back kind of optimistic about potentially having a future, back home, I just had to start looking around again, and go, right, where hasn't been destroyed, by the financial crisis. And, and so that was around 08, 09, and you're just like, well, this is, and again, because science is one of those things that, a government, when they have a surpluses, especially in Ireland, they'd never really invested in science before, but they had all this money they didn't know what to do with. And they thought, we'll invest in science. We'll have lots of patents, lots of companies. If we put 10 billion in, we'll get 100 billion back. And, it doesn't work that way. You have to invest for a century or two, in a culture. You don't get it in a decade.
That's right. And
so when I was there, I mean, I was just... They took money straight out of science. It was the first thing that was getting chopped.
Shit.
And you can see that, in the UK, I mean, even though they ring-fenced science funding, it wasn't linked to inflation. So the budget was stable. So effectively, they cut the budget. And I guess here, Australia does well, for its population size, definitely punches above its weight scientifically. But again, the tax base is 20 million people.
Right.
It's a third the size of the UK.
Right.
So it can never, really financially compete. And so, here, funding for research is, crazily competitive.
Yeah.
And it's getting worse. I mean, the funding success rates in medical research are less than 15%.
That's scary.
And,
that
so... Which is why I think sometimes, when I talk to students, they don't consider having to move away.
Right. Yeah, no, I think...
to pursue a career.
That's right.
And I think that's an important option to think about. Yeah. There's Aussies all over the globe, so some of you have thought of it.
Yeah.
Or us, because I'm Aussie now.
It's interesting because in my first and second year, I wanted to do science, but... I didn't know what it would encompass, as in what you had to do after you finish your PhD. You have to travel, otherwise, like that's everybody's looking for that. You need to get that experience, and jobs you may not find it in Sydney. So that's challenging, and security is also a big thing in working in science. So you did your postdocs, but you came to Australia to do a third postdoc?
No. So my third postdoc was the one in Ireland. And at that point, I was on sort of 1-year contracts in research, which is a horrible way to live.
Right,
And, it's just because it's very hard to secure long-term funding.
Sure.
And so I came to the point where we had, they offered a lecturer job in Dublin.
Okay.
But the contract was only 2 years with a rolling 1 year after that. And then, because I was really frustrated with short-term contracts. I think a number of researchers will probably say that's the worst thing in their lives.
Right.
Is the insecurity of the positions, because you can't necessarily put down roots.
Nope.
And if you do, then you're really restricting yourself.
Yeah.
So you have to be prepared to move every 3 years.
Yeah.
And it depends on, have you been able to get money, or has money come up somewhere? So you've always, and in that time, you've either got to be applying for your own funding, or you've just got to be publishing really well and be a very desirable candidate. So there's always a pressure, in that regard. But
so did you apply here for like how did you?
Yeah. So
did you come straight to UWS? Sorry.
Yeah, I did. So it was a bit of a weird thing. I was looking for positions, and there were a few. I was thinking maybe postdoctoral positions, and basically I saw a job being advertised at what was then UWS.
Right.
I didn't know much about UWS, but I was like, Sydney, I've been there on holiday, so that's not so bad. Obviously, I wouldn't come to Campbelltown for a holiday, but it's you don't know that at the time,
right?
And I just took a punt on an application, and there was an interview on the phone, rather than Skype, which was good because it was about 6 a.m. in Ireland, and I just walked out in my pajamas, got on the phone, did a presentation, had a chat, and a few weeks later, these guys offered me a job.
Nice.
They offered me a job in Ireland at the same time, and I had been saying to my colleagues, look, I would swim across an ocean for tenure. And, basically they said after probation, it's a tenured position here in Western. And I was like, well, I'm not a hypocrite, so I'm not going to swim though. Like, they paid for the flight, and it's a bit of an upheaval. You're not going to see your family.
Yeah.
And luckily, I'm not married and don't have children, so there's no, I don't have people crying because they're going to miss their friends.
Right.
And you don't have to move a family, but yeah, some of my colleagues have done that. But yeah, I mean, it was nobody was hiring at that time. And certainly not to a tenured position.
So, okay, they're not offering tenure positions anymore, are they? Because
some.
I feel like the move has gone towards more casual employment and less tenure positions.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of things are going to change very soon in terms of the casualization of teaching. In the US, it's almost they've moved away from hiring full-time academics, and there's a high degree of casualization. And I think Australia's, it's on that knife point of going either way. I think what they're looking at more is maybe fixed-term contracts for academics in certain circumstances. But if you want to get people, like, there's no way I would have come to Western without the carrot of tenure.
Right.
And I think a lot of people wouldn't have come either.
Yeah.
But and that's important. You need some stability in your life after being, a vagabond scientist for a decade. You just want to put down roots somewhere.
Sure.
And I hadn't done teaching. I'd done sort of full-time research, so that was exciting and new for about a week. And then you realize your life changes, and then you have an existential crisis, and then you're like, was it worth it?
That's funny.
No, I mean, the thing, I didn't become a scientist because I wanted to teach anyone.
Right.
I was interested in subject areas. I wanted to, pursue knowledge in that form. And I think a lot of science is like that. It's not necessarily about the thing. It's not that I'm interested in mushrooms, but I'm interested in mushrooms, but I also want to expand knowledge. You get to discover things no one's ever known before.
Sure, yeah.
And even if that's a small thing, it's still new. Not everyone's doing things that are a Nobel Prize.
No, that's true.
And if they were, then there'd be 10 scientists.
Yeah, no, that's true.
And it wouldn't be a thing. But yeah, when I went to Dublin, I went to full fat medical research. So that was looking at an infection called aspergillosis. So I moved from a centre of biomolecular sciences in Scotland, which was very much structural biology and fundamental biology, to looking at sort of medical research, which is much more applied. So I was in the School of Medicine in Dublin and in a Department of Clinical Microbiology. And so that was probably, that was a really good project in many ways. I mean, it was difficult in terms of the funding, which, for the first 2 or 3 years was stable, but then for the final year and a half was a bit less stable.
Right.
But that was really good because it was an EU project again, but doing that as a postdoc, you get a lot more out of it. So I went to a lot of meetings, went to a lot of other labs, made a lot of connections and collaborations, and and a lot of that is what kind of sustains my research career as well, are those connections.
Wow.
Getting involved with them in terms of, committees, grant writing research articles, co-supervision of students, and just everything, has come out of a lot of those associations. And so at some point, the other thing you have to do, going from being a PhD student to a postdoc and it's not always easy for everyone, is learning how to network and form collaborations and associations with other groups, because nobody does science in isolation.
No.
And because a lot of questions are big and they're difficult and different people have different expertise or different access, then you have to work across borders, and everyone does their bit. You hope, except when it comes to writing. It's like, we have to get a report in on the 5th. It's like, I was like, no, I start working on the deadline. It's like,
that's funny.
That's okay for you.
You're a professor. That sounds like group projects in undergrad. That's hilarious. Let me ask you about what you're doing now. So are you currently researching?
Yeah. So the research I'm doing now ties into the work I did in Dublin, where I was looking at aspergillosis. So the lab situation is a bit different now. So I'm basically my own lab leader. So
you're PI.
PI, yeah. PI without the money. No, you don't have as much money. It's obviously it can be quite difficult when you're not in a research-only institution or where you have a lot of time devoted to teaching. It can be a little more challenging. But this is why students are really good, having PhD students or master's students or honours students when we had those. You can get people to work on projects. So we've really been looking at fungal virulence and virulence of human pathogenic fungi. So it's very hard to experiment on people. Apparently there's human ethical guidelines, and you're not allowed to do it. So that's been a problem in everyone's research. But apparently it's illegal if I do it, and I don't want to go to prison. So we look at it from a molecular basis, but we're also moving into using invertebrate models, because basically invertebrates have a simplified immune system. And you can use and they are infected by fungi, so you can test fungal virulence in insect larvae.
Okay.
So basically, mealworms, the next upcoming food source, but also you can inject them with fungi, and you can start examining virulence. And we're also looking at alternative treatments to antibiotics. So looking at photodynamic therapy, where we use photoexcitable substances, such as rose bengal, and they traverse biological membranes, and so those end up in bacteria or in fungi, and then you shine a light and that photoexcites the substance and then it kills the target organism.
Oh wow.
So that's been something we've been working on, as a smallish project for the last few years, but some students have gotten projects out of, and it's something that can potentially be developed. So it's not good for necessarily invasive infections, but for superficial infections, skin infections.
Right.
Could
Like
be
a
really
topical cream, they can shine like that.
Yeah. So you put a cream on that contains the photo-excitable substance, then you shine a light of specific wavelength, and then kill the organism, hopefully not kill yourself. Well, yeah, and that's part of the testing we're doing. We're trying to see how effective it is against particular topical infections, so sort of the ringworm fungi and the ones that cause athlete's foot, and also looking at MRSA, because one of the things with Staph aureus is that it tends to cause necrotic infections on the skin, or wound infections. So this could be a nice application.
So MRSA, multi-resistant,
methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus.
Sorry.
Yeah. So they're kind of
the projects that you're working on.
Yeah. So I'm mainly interested in, the other thing I'm doing with a colleague called Hayley Green is she does forensic anthropology. And so we've started looking at using signatures of microbes after death as a way to determine how long someone's been dead. So looking at post-mortem interval by assessing the microbes that are growing on the corpse.
Wow. So you could use this for forensics.
Yeah, potentially. So they've used insects for a long time in forensic entomology, but forensic microbiology has been emerging over the last sort of 5 years.
Wow.
And so it uses a number of skills. It uses, sort of high throughput DNA sequencing. It uses, a lot of, interesting analysis, and combines well with standard forensic biology. So that's something we're into as well. I mean, it's good to have these kind of fun side projects. I mean, luckily I don't go into the field and collect the samples, because they have pigs rotting in the fields in Hawkesbury. and then students have to go and swab the pigs at both ends.
Yeah. Well, there was an MRes student, I think she was, it's like a quote-unquote COC that she gave last year, and she was in the same cohort as I was, and she was looking at like rotten pigs.
Yeah, it was probably Steph. Yeah, it was probably the students who's working with us at the moment. But yeah, I mean the problems I have with the pigs is the way they decompose. I mean, sometimes the ends blow out. And they bloat, and
of course,
they liquefy, and
can
there's
you imagine
maggot masses running out of their noses, and
I can't imagine. Apparently there was, this may be completely fictitious, but apparently there was a whale that kind of washed up on the shore. I think it was in America or somewhere. And they had the great idea of exploding it.
Yeah, it's not probably the best way to dispose of.
The whole place stunk like.
Yeah, no. It turns out, depending on the time of year, that a dead body may bloat and deform significantly.
Depending on the time of the year.
Yeah, so, if it's warmer, the microbes grow quicker, produce more gas within the body, and they bloat up.
Yeah.
I think in winter, if, because water is less available, especially they can mummify. And so you get different forms of decomposition, which then presents different challenges in trying to determine, when they died, or how long they've been there. And so looking at distinctive microbial populations could be helpful for that. But don't stick a pin in a bloating corpse.
No, don't do that.
Because
that won't be a fun experience, most
no,
likely.
and definitely stay away from whales.
Yeah, no.
Kids, all of you out there in TV land.
That's funny.
But yeah, so it's good to. The good thing about, once you become a lecturer as opposed to a principal researcher in a research institute, it gives you a little bit of freedom to do projects like that. And sort of, you can take a step back and sort of think about what you're doing more. Whereas when you're at a research institute, there's a lot of pressure to publish, to bring in money, to make sure that you are a key player in your field.
Right.
And and it's impossible to be that way at a university, especially like this university, where it's, although they say they're research focused, they're very teaching intensive. really teaching intensive.
Yeah.
But it's fair enough. I mean, that's the business of a university, is teaching students, but also doing research. So it's a little bit different, and it takes a bit of getting used to, especially when you've come from being a full-time researcher, and also dealing with students is a bit different.
I'm sure a challenge.
Well, it helps you with your people skills.
Of course, yeah.
But I think it's good as well in terms of communication. I think in terms of presentation as well. When you're doing 2-hour lectures every week, it's very different to doing a 15-minute presentation at a conference.
That's true.
And you don't do those every week.
No.
So it's
good practice.
it's been very good in terms of speaking.
For sure.
But and it helps you deal with lots of people from very diverse backgrounds, like our students. So it's if you're not learning stuff in the job, then you're going backwards. So it's been
agree.
There have been valuable elements, because a lot of the time I'm just happy to talk to mycologists, or once upon a time, and just talk about my research and run away from humans. Unless someone's in a lab coat, it's like just run away from them. But I think that's probably been a problem in science for a while.
Yeah.
And I think with things like your podcast and young scientists coming through who really want to communicate, I think that's definitely a positive for the future.
For the future.
Let's
we have 2 more questions that I'd like to ask you, because we've gone past 1 hour.
A lot of time.
That's it.
Good luck with editing.
No, we usually don't even edit this.
Oh no.
Just take out the beginning and probably a bit at the end, and that's it.
Okay.
And we just smack it on.
There will be swearing now.
Oh. What would be so 2 last questions.
Yep.
Looking into the future, and this can be in whatever context, what scares you?
Into the future, I'm not really one of those worried about the future, scared kind of people. I'm not. Look, life's going to happen. I think a lot of people worry about technology. I've had some conversations recently with colleagues who are very concerned about where artificial intelligence is going, or where technology is taking us. And if we're not moving forwards, then we're in trouble. I mean that is human nature. That's what's done so much for us, is embracing technology, moving forwards. Society has to change. It can't stay in one place. So I think change is really good. I'd sort of echo Steve Jobs' sentiments. When he was dying, he said, like, death is probably the most important thing in life, because it's an agent of change. At a certain point, your values are fixed. Like, most of your thoughts are fixed. Most of what you're not going to learn too many deep things after a certain age. If people like that remain, then there's no turnover, there's no new ideas, there's no forward momentum. And so, you have to just embrace the time that you have, not be afraid. If you spend your time being afraid, you're just not going to live life.
Yeah, you've wasted your time.
Yeah, it's a pretty bad state to be in. People who are afraid tend to make bad decisions, or they make decisions for the wrong reasons. I think it's good to embrace change. I think it's good to embrace the idea that you'll have your time, make the most of it, and then hand off to the next generation, and good luck to them. Although I'm not leaving my job anytime soon.
I was like, you can hand that off to me all you want. I'd be happy to take that tenure position.
Well, that was the thing. I remember being a student, walking around the corridors going, when are you retiring? When are you... how quick's the turnover in this? Because I think when you get to the point where you're like, right, I think I want to be, one of these crazy academics, you're like, great, when did the jobs appear?
Yeah.
Usually when they carry someone out of their office.
No, that's true.
And so there are many more, PhD graduates than there are people who are ever going to end up in positions.
In academic
positions. And so it's good to realize that there are a variety of options outside of it, but that, I was a postdoc for 10 years. You sometimes have to be very patient. But also the requirements in fields are a bit different. Like if you want to be a microbiologist and, get into an academic position, you have to postdoc, you have to publish a lot. You have to, make a lot of groundwork out in the world before you'll be hired. Whereas in other disciplines, you could walk into an academic job straight from your PhD.
Sure, yeah.
And so it's a bit discipline specific as well. But no, I mean, what scares me, just the standard stuff, losing the old marbles as I get older, but I don't think it's a good way to live if you're spending your time worried about bad things,
I agree.
We could all die in the morning, but
No, that's true.
as long as you've lived a good life,
That's all that matters.
Yeah.
What's the flip side of that is, what are you most hopeful for when you look into the future?
I just like the idea that, progress is being made in spite of some of the, sort of negative detractors, like in spite of things like Trump, anti-science movement, and that we're generally going forwards. And I think, when, obviously a flat earth society, there's a lot of young members, but we're not talking about, these guys are hilarious.
God.
But no, when you see the advances that are being made, I'd love to be able to come back in 200 years and see where the field is. It's just the amazing opportunities and understanding biology at, much, and just seeing what the questions are, what's been answered, where are we going next. And I think, just thinking of the progress that's been made in a century compared to 2,000 years prior is incredible. So where we end up in the next sort of 50 years will be hopefully really, really amazing, and, despite the challenges that face us in the short term, I think the long-term outlook's really positive, and fungi will rule the world and surrounding suburbs.
Maybe the cordyceps mushrooms can take over our brains, and then...
I hope so.
Hey.
Which game is it? Is it The Last of Us? That's a PlayStation game, and this fungal disease turns people into zombies. I think it's a bit based on the cordyceps idea. At least I there was a Vsauce episode that tied that together, so that was quite good. Yeah, no, seriously.
He does makes good videos. But doesn't the cordyceps mushroom infect ants, right? And a bunch of animals.
It infects a lot of insects.
Yeah.
Not so much animals that we know of, but there are different strains of cordyceps, and they all have a specific insect host. Right. But in animals, the closest thing is toxoplasmosis.
Oh, yeah, the cat one.
The cat one, yeah. So they did the classic experiment where it turns out that toxoplasmosis makes mice and rats more risky in their behavior, so that a standard rat or mouse will run away from cat urine, whereas one with toxoplasmosis gets curious about it and goes towards it, which would indicate that you're heading into the territory of a cat.
I heard that it gets sexually attracted to the urine.
Well,
is that true?
I don't know exactly, but it's thought that, especially with undercooked meats, a lot of people have undiagnosed toxoplasma. And so there was one, and I don't know how true the study is, I saw it in a newspaper, so fake news, you've got to be careful, was that they found that people in car accidents in France had a disproportionate incidence of toxoplasma.
Wow. I heard the same thing about motorbike accidents.
Yeah, it's possible. That it could also just be being a man between 18 and 23 is the equivalent, in terms of risky behavior. But yeah, so it seems to dull inhibitions and lead to risky behavior. Because basically, the cat is the host that toxoplasma reproduces in. So it has one of these complex parasitic life cycles. So it needs to end up in an intermediate host and then go back to its original host to undergo reproduction. So obviously, it wants to get back into a cat. So if it's ended up in a mouse, obviously you want the mouse to get eaten.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a dead end in people.
Right.
You know, because it's like, well, it wants you to go get yourself killed, but
Right.
we're unlikely to end up in the mouth, in the stomach of a lion,
That's
you know,
true. Yeah.
unless, you know, obviously you become a crazy cat lady and
Hey.
get eaten by your cats, you know, once you die, and have stopped feeding them.
So it's just a mechanism that the cordyceps mushroom, toxoplasmosis has, is by driving people to their deaths, or animals to their deaths.
Potentially, yeah. So it can complete its life cycle.
That is.
But it's the
cool.
same with cordyceps. I mean, you know, it changes the behavior of the insects so that they will typically go to higher levels in the trees, so that then when the cordyceps burst out the back of their head, it's able to shower spores on the rest of the ants. So it's trying to turn the zombie ant into this dispersal mechanism.
Oh, shit.
So that's why it takes over. And I think ants that recognize the early signs kick the ants out of the colony.
Right. I heard that they actually grab them and carry them.
Yeah, they take them right away.
Yeah.
Because basically, you know, one ant infected, you know, if it gets into position, releases millions of spores.
And then millions of ants get
Then
infected.
lots of ants are like, you know, damn it, we can't work today.
Gone zombie. The Walking Dead.
The Walking Dead of ants.
Ant edition.
I think those are the ants you want to come across, though, because they're less likely to attack you.
Oh, if they have the cordyceps.
I think so, because they're not as interested
Fair
in defending the colony or doing anything good.
That's true.
They're just, you know, hanging around so they can kill off their friends. But no, I mean, I guess the interesting thing about those organisms is you know, determining what chemical mediators are influencing behavior.
Right.
Because, you know, if you can pin down some of the chemical signals in terms of behavior, then you can look at, you know, helping people with behavioral disorders as well. So you can pick apart the chemistry as well a bit and see if something beneficial.
That is.
Or it's just easier to send soldiers to war if they're just, you know, a bit zombified.
Oh my God.
You know, just on a dark note.
On a dark note, that reminds me of Black Mirror. Have you watched Black Mirror?
No, I haven't. I've heard it's really good.
I'll send you when I send you this episode.
Yeah.
I'll send you a link to an episode that you'll definitely appreciate because it's on that theme. Yeah. But
okay, guys, Dark Mirror.
It's been an hour and 20 minutes. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah,
Oliver.
you're totally welcome.
Appreciate it. This was really fun.
Okay, I'm glad it was good.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to BLab Codes. Rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, because it does help us spread the word. And if you like what we're doing here, then help us grow it by sharing this with a friend of a friend, or your mailman, even your mailman's mailman. We also want to hear from you, so send us questions or comments to blabcodes@gmail.com. And if you have any interesting questions or comments, then we'll talk about it on air.